Well, hi there, Kathy here, and today we're going to talk about some of the beginnings of how to get started with watercolour. And we'll be just covering some basics so you've got a good foundation before you actually start creating your masterpiece in watercolour. So I'm just going to switch cameras now so you can see what my hands are doing on the table. There we go. So I guess the first, so there's just some basics to get started with watercolour. We need some paint, so we can use watercolour paints. Now I use tubes. I tend to go towards using better quality ones. So the Winsor Newton is one that I use most often. This one is Schmincke, which is a good one, and this more Winsor Newton. So Winsor Newton is pretty much my standby. You can get some palettes with the little tube, it's a bit dirty, sorry. That's a Rembrandt. Rembrandt's very good quality, but it's got a basic palette in there, a really good starter palette. So if you're just getting started, something like that might be a good place to start. Now, what I have done in the past, and I probably don't really recommend it, but I do have a palette which I have. My colours are pretty much a whole tube is being emptied into the wells, so I've got plenty of paint on standby whenever I want it. I suggest it's a bit easier to just put out an amount that you want to use on a particular time, because that way the paint's nice and soft and it's fresh and it's easier to mix with water. Now, speaking of water, you need a lot of very clean water, filtered water if you can. The quality of the water can make a difference too, which is really quite fascinating. I use filtered water and some brushes. Now you can spend a lot of money on brushes, or you can just get some basic brushes. I have a few favourites, and these three would be my favourites at the moment, and I'll use this little guy sometimes. Now these two are actually from the discount store, and they're actually, it's a 24 and it's a Montmartre Gallery series, and it's actually an acrylic brush, this one, and it works really well with the watercolour. Gets a lovely point. You want to be able to get a nice point and that nice round bristle. This one's a bit smaller, so I'll use this one to wet large areas. I'll use this one to put the paint on and to really get into some really fine little areas. And I'll use this one, which is so old, I don't think it's got anything written on it, but it is a squirrel hair brush. So I probably paid a reasonable amount for that 40 years ago. And as you can see, it's still as good as new, apart from the fact you can't read what the hell it is. So I'll use that to soften edges. And this little guy, I've got to do something really fiddly and a very tight little corner. I can wet that one down and get a really tight, sharp point on it. So if I want to do really detailed work, I can do that. But the details come last. So we've got our brushes, we've got our paint. The next thing is your paper. So you're painting on paper. Now, I suggest getting a really good quality paper. I use Arches watercolour paper. Cold press, you can use hot press. It'll give you a very different result. Again, the Montmartre from the discount stores. Montmartre has a pretty good watercolour paper that you can use. And the Renault Art has one too. The Renault I find a little bit difficult to use. So, or the different papers, going for the quality in the beginning, the Arches is really getting quite expensive now, but it's such beautiful and forgiving paper to work with. So it really is nice to use. It comes in quite large sheets. I just cut them into the sizes that I want to use. And I guess then we're ready. I'm just going to use this. Now I put my, this is actually a Montmartre painting board. It's still got its plastic wrapper on it, and I use that as my backing board because I find it just a really good size. It's a 40 by 50 board, and I find that very helpful, particularly when I'm doing 40 by 50 paintings. I will use tape, which is from the hardware store. It's for painting, like you would use that on windows. Paint Partner, it's called. I like this. It's expensive, but I reuse it and reuse it and reuse it. So it can go on, it'll peel off, you can put it back on, you can use it again. So sometimes it's worth just investing in a good quality thing. As you can see, I can put that on, I can take it off, and it doesn't damage the paper at all. So this is quite a good tape just to hold it down. Now, if I was going to do a full wet in wet, there's different techniques, I will talk about that too, but I would put the tape all the way around at times. Now, there are different ways to handle watercolour, and one of those is probably the first thing to get to realise is, oh, well, I think that we might actually look at, it's a very dirty palette, I should just clean it a bit, because we'll get pure colour if we clean it. If we leave it that, we'll get mud. I keep a roll of paper towel handy. I have that next to my water, so as I take my paintbrush out, I will dab it onto the paper towel just to dry off all the excess water out of it. So we don't want to flood our paper either. Now, if we're going to mix up a colour, and I'll just choose a random colour here so we can just see what that does here today. I know I've got some ultramarine here and little puddles, so I'm going to just add water to that and get a nice, and I'm adding the water, and we'll just do a nice ultramarine. Oh, we might do a sky. Let's do a sky. Landscape's not my very favourite thing, but skies are quite good fun. So really, we want a nice, if we're going to do a reasonable amount of sky, for example, we would have a nice puddle. Now, once we've got that mixed up, so we can see we've got a fair bit of water in that. It's a really watery little puddle of paint. I'm going to pop that aside while I look at my paper. So I've just got this little piece of paper here. It's just an offcut, really. So I'm washing my brush. I'm dabbing it onto the paper towel. It's still got a fair bit of blue in it, so I'm just going to give it another little clean. And I use my paper towel, and I just use the roll. I don't peel it off until after it's too grotty that I can't use it anymore. So I'm going to, this is called wet in wet. It's a wet in wet technique, and we'll just use this as an example of what you can do with watercolour. I'll just do half of it, I think, because you can see the difference then. So wet in wet is where we wet the paper down without necessarily applying colour. And I'll take my smaller Montmartre brush and I'll collect up some of that lovely ultramarine blue, and I will lay that into the wet paint. Now you can see how that will spread out. If we tip the board up, it'll float down. It's on a bit of a slope, so I have it on a bit of a slope. If I add a bit more water to that, that'll bring it down a bit more, and we can do what's called a glaze just by simply doing that, and then take it all the way down to the bottom. We can add more paint while it's wet. Can't touch it until it's dry. After this, we get this in, we can just leave it like that, and we can do this lovely glaze with the wet and wet. Now, if we wanted to add different colours to that, you can, I don't know whether you can see it, but the colour is still bleeding down there. We could do that while it's still wet, but we can't really, when it's half dry, we can't touch it. Now, there's a fair bit of water on the edge there. I can just take a clean brush and clean that off on the edge just to tidy it up. Now, that's wet in wet. We would leave that to dry. So, for example, now if I was going to do a flower petal, for example, so the first thing I might do is I might draw the shape of the petal. And I don't really know what sort of flower it is, but let's just say that's a flower, a petal of a flower or a leaf. So I would just wet inside that area that I've just drawn, get my other brush and load it up with some colour, and I'm going to get some nice wet red just for the example here, just to show the difference. And I can just drop that in there. Now, I can just take it off to the edge. So I've got plenty of paint in there, and this is where I will grab my other little squirrel brush and just go to the edges. Now before, when I put the water on, I hadn't gone all the way to the edge. So I can then use my little squirrel brush to wet out to the edge, and it will take the colour, the pigment, all the way out to the edge. Now, if I wanted to add some highlights in there, I can use my little squirrel brush with just pure water on it and pick out some colour. So if I wanted the highlights to be on that side and the deeper colour on the other side, I can do it like that. So that's wet in wet. Now, what happens with this, it looks quite bright at the moment, but what happens is watercolour dries lighter. So it will dry off a fair bit lighter. And now we've got some interesting things happening there, the pigment's running down in different places. If this was a sky, we could just do something like scrunch up a little paper towel, make ourselves a nice little ball like that, and we could actually pick out some clouds. So we'd have a cloudy sky rather than just a clear blue sky. So this could be the part of a seascape or a landscape. So you could do that and come back in once it's dry and drop in some shadows under the clouds and put in the lights and the darks on your clouds. But there's the foundation of your cloud, could be a wave even. Now my little petal, different pigments will do different things. Now that particular colour is, it's Winsor red, and it tends to run a lot. Others won't do that so much. So you do tend to lose your highlights quite a lot with the Winsor red, which is one of those things that you pick up as time goes on and experimenting with your different pigments. And I suggest that you get a basic range of colours. You don't want to get every colour on the planet. And I have done a selection of colours here. So 2 reds, so the cadmium red and the alizarin crimson, a lemon yellow and a cad yellow. You can get this, you can grab some of the other yellows if you want, but I would just go with a cool yellow and a warm yellow. So this is a warm red and a cool red. A cool yellow and cadmium yellow is a warm yellow. Some of the earth colours, which are your raw sienna and your raw umber. Burnt umber is also a very useful one. Now, greens you can make, but Viridian's pretty handy and sap green's pretty handy. So those two you might include. Viridian is often included when you buy one of those little palettes with everything in it. Your blues, you would want to go with an ultramarine blue, a cobalt blue and a cerulean blue. Those 3 blues are very useful. I also add indigo, and I also have some Winsor blue in my palette that I tend to use. That is my basic palette. I do have some occasionally, I'll buy something just to see what it does. But it's not essential. You can pretty well do everything with cadmium red, alizarin crimson, lemon yellow, cadmium yellow, raw sienna, raw and burnt umber, Viridian and sap green, and then your 3 blues, which are ultramarine, cobalt and cerulean. I tend to use indigo a lot, so I always have a good supply of indigo as well. Indigo and alizarin crimson make a really lovely purple for shadows, so I use those a bit. They are staining colours, so they can be a bit tricky. That's some watercolour is transparent, some is opaque. Now the cadmiums are quite opaque, so those are the other things that we need to be aware of. Now this was wet in wet, and as it dries, it will dry quite a bit lighter. And then if you're going to do a wet in dry, so the paper's dry and we're applying paint to that as is, and it will dry much darker than this one up here where I've added water to it. So you can then, which is quite useful if you want to dry that off and just get some texture, for example, by using the texture of the paper to create some things, some pattern and texture in your work. there are many different things you can do. You can drop salt in it. You can use your paper to blot out colours, and so you get your highlight. Now with watercolour, we're working from light to dark. So we start off with our white paper, and we always want to conserve our whites. So always be aware of where your whites are going to be and where you're going to keep them as the painting progresses. It's really a lesson in control, keeping them all under control and not losing your whites. So experiment, grab yourself some good quality paper. Some of the Montmartre is great for these, playing around and seeing what colours do. I might just give that a flip over. And one of the things that is really fun to do is, for example, take some of our ultramarine blue. We can just lay that down and then take another colour and see what happens when they get next to each other. Now, for this experiment, I've chosen alizarin crimson, quite a strong colour. Now, what happens when they touch? You can see how the alizarin crimson just runs off into the ultramarine blue. Now, there are times that is absolutely sensational, where you really want that to happen. It's quite beautiful, and that is how one of the beauties of watercolour is that how these colours just really work together and create something different, something quite unique that you actually couldn't do if you were trying to do it manually. And you can just drop some colour into it and just watch how it just spreads out and changes. And I did this with my grandchildren last week, and one of the kids got quite enamoured with just doing a little drop of colour and then dropping another little drop of colour in it, just to see what happened and where it went and what patterns it made. And look, it's a great way to learn about what your watercolours are doing, because it's one thing, one of the biggest things with watercolour is learning how the colours behave on your paper and with the water, and the interaction, that chemical interaction of what goes on with the water, the paper and the pigment. And once you get a handle on it, and it really is an experiment with it and getting the feel for it, but once you do that, you can create some really beautiful things. So I hope you enjoyed that, and pop over to Paint Along. I'll write it here. Paint Along. It's got a dash. .com.au, where you'll find lots more tips and freebies for you to enjoy. So have fun, have some experiments, grab yourself some good quality things to play with. And thanks for tuning in.